Hi, my name is Maya. Thank you so much for joining me. This is an introduction to pastels, more specifically to the supplies. So in other words, different kinds of pastel pencils, pastels, papers, fixatives, glycine, things like that. All the things you might need to create a pastel artwork. So here's a screenshot of some of the supplies I have. On the left-hand side, you'll see Conte à Paris, which are really great, but as you can see, quite a big pencil, quite a grainy pencil. I also have Krita color, which are a little bit finer, and some Caran d'Ache, and also chalk or soft pastels, which are actually the half sticks. I really do love my Unison pastels. One of the reasons why I love them is because they're really high quality. They roll by hand. Secondly, is that they really have a high pigment and they have a very fine powder. In other words, they layer really well and they cover really well. So the quality of your pastel drawing comes out really great. But there are other brands out there which are really wonderful as well. The only thing I would say for you to look out for is when you're purchasing pastels is to really go for softer pastels. Hard pastels such as the Prismacolor NuPastel can be hard. In other words, they do not have as high a pigment, they're a little bit more grainy, they're a little bit more transparent. You can layer them as well. Whereas like I said, the Unison pastels, nice and thick. I like to call them buttery. There are also different kinds of pastel pencils. And like you can see, I've got the Conte à Paris and I've got the Krita color. And they're all made differently, but you can interchange them. Not every brand will have all the colors, so sometimes it's nice to kind of get certain colors from different brands of pencils and actually use them, interchange them together. They all like to be friends, so you really do not have to stick just to one kind of pastel pencils. So here is a little bit of a close-up of some of them. So Conte à Paris, they're a little bit thicker. I would say they're one of the most difficult ones to sharpen. That seems to come up a lot, sharpening of pastel pencils. So basically what pastels are a fine powder with some kind of a binding agent. So in order for a pastel to be in a pencil form, they need to have binding agent added to them and then obviously inserted into a piece of wood. So the more binding agent you have inside a pastel pencil, the more translucent and finer and thinner the pastel is going to be, the softer, so it's also going to be harder. Also, the softer and more crumbly the pastel pencil is, the nicer it looks on your piece of paper, but also more difficult to sharpen. So for example, Conte à Paris, a little bit grainy. They've got lovely color. They're also quite powdery, so they layer really well. But like I said, their downside is that they are a little bit thicker, chunkier, a little bit more difficult to handle. But I do use them, and I do sharpen them with an anti-cutter or an X-Acto knife, which I'll show you a little bit later. Faber-Castell Pit Pastels are one of my least favorite. They are really great for details because, as you can see out of the few that I have on the screen, this one has got the sharpest point, and you can actually use a normal sharpener with them and then give you a nice point to them. But because they give you a nice point and because they have a higher percentage of binding agent inside, what ends up happening is that they're not able to layer as well. So you're not able to build up the layers and actually get the colors that you would like. So they are really lovely, but I would say personally for me, I like to use them for little details, extra bits and pieces. I don't really do a full artwork with my Pit Pastel pencils. The Caran d'Ache are really great as well. They're soft and buttery, but as you can see, I also use my anti-cutter or my X-Acto knife on them, so they're a little bit more crumbly. Like the Krita color, they got the finer kind of powder in them too, but they're really great. And again, I interchange interchange between all of them and actually use them together. If you were to layer your pencils, sometimes it's better to use a thinner pencil, such as pastel pencil as the underlayer, and then if you want to build up more layers and actually build up more color, you would switch to something which is a little bit more powdery. So for example, switch to a creaser color pastel pencil or a Conte Apparis pencil. But if you were to start with a Conte Apparis or start with a creaser color and then use a Faber-Castell Pit Pastel pencil over it, sometimes it can scrape away what's already on your piece of paper rather than layer. So they do have a certain level of almost like translucency, or kind of like a thinner layer of pastel versus a thicker, more opaque layer, and the creaser color and the Conte Apparis are a little bit thicker and nicer to use. And I know that there are other brands on the market, but I'm just showing you these ones for now. Then, of course, there are other papers. There are many different kinds of papers, all depends on your budget, and I'm not even showing you all of them. I find that if you're really not sure which paper to get, I'm gonna talk to you openly about what each one does, and then hopefully you can decide which one you would like to get, or if you're not certain. So for example, if you're a complete beginner, if you really don't know, you don't want to invest right now, you are just kind of figuring out what does a pastel feel like in your hand, how does it work, you can use construction paper. I would say it's better to use a pastel stick on construction paper than this to use a pastel pencil on construction paper. However, in one of the demos, which I'll share as well, you'll see me working with a pastel pencil on construction paper. You'll get a very basic drawing done. Don't expect any high art on this paper. It's very cheap, but it is a nice introduction. On the other hand, we have something which is called UArt pastel paper, and you get different grades like 400, 600. I think sometimes you get even 800 grade paper. The higher the grade, the smoother the paper. Basically, pastel paper is like sandpaper. That's basically what you're looking for. You're looking for sandpaper. You're not looking for like a cold press paper, for watercolor paper, where the paper is a little bit like, you know, nooks and valleys and it's a little bit bumpy. You can almost feel the paper. This is more of a sandpaper. I'm sure you know what it feels like. It feels like you can sand down the fingerprints on your hand. It's really a little bit rough. So what that means is that the paper itself has almost got these little like gripping hands, I like to call it, and then the pastel comes into the paper, and the pastel paper grips the paper. So the lower the grade of the paper, the rougher the texture is, and the higher the grade, the smoother it is. And it doesn't always mean that the smoother it is, that less grippy or less effective. I actually prefer a slightly smoother paper than a rougher paper. A rougher paper, like a 400 grade, can give you lots of texture. So if you want lots of texture in your work, I would say go for a 400 grade. If you want finer details, if you want sharper lines, and you'll see later in my work that I'd like to work fine, that you can go for a higher grade. And this is, some people really like this, the UArt paper, and they really enjoy working on it. It's also more accessible in terms of price point, whereas you get some other papers such as Clairefontaine, which is lovely and almost smooth, but very grippy, but also very expensive. This is my favorite paper, the Clairefontaine Pastel Matte. One of the reasons why I like it is because it lets me create really clean work. It doesn't create a lot of dust as I'm working on my pastels. It actually like takes the pastel and holds on to it. There's a little bit of extra powder kind of coming off it, but not too much. It is expensive. This is the one stumbling block for many people who work with me, is that like, Maja, why is this so expensive? I think it's worth it. I find sometimes, if not often, the paper is more important than the pastel itself. But understand that if this is too much, then you can go for one of the other papers. There's also, such as I'm showing you here, the Canson or the Strathmore pastel paper. I really, really hate them. I know that people can produce great work on them. I've seen drawings on Canson or Strathmore pastel paper, which come out great. it just agitates me. One of the reasons why it agitates me is if you can see like all the little indents on the paper surface. What ends up happening is that you have to work a little bit harder to get that pastel into the paper itself, right? Whereas on the other papers, it just creates one smooth surface. So I find I end up working harder on these papers, and I don't really like the effect, and the texture constantly shines through my work, which drives me a little bit crazy. But having said that, I have seen work of my students or people who work with me who really do great stuff and they really like it and it's fantastic. So again, it's a personal choice. Always go for the thing that makes you feel better, that really aligns with you, that makes you feel good when you're working. Other papers I haven't included in this slide is, for example, the Canson Medien's Touch, which is also a little bit like a sandpaper. It is closest in comparison to the UArt pastel paper. It's also got a little bit of a rough texture. It creates a fair amount of powder, so it kind of has a little bit of kind of buildup of powder on your paper, which can be a little bit annoying, and it doesn't actually let you build up as much. Another one, which is, I believe, the Sennelier pastel card, and that is very rough paper. It is fantastic, but that paper, really great for texture, but that paper can eat your pastel sticks for breakfast. It can be really, really heavy on your pastels. So if you don't mind using a lot of pastels, that paper is really great. But this isn't always the answer for your work. So just giving you a few options in case you go to the store and you're not sure what to get. Okay, then we have other supplies that kind of make our life a little bit easier. Another thing, I love to use my fingers. Fingers are really great for blending. I find that that is the most effective tool for me anyway, to blend my pastel. However, it isn't always useful. Fingers can be big. And also not always the most, sometimes we get when we work with dirty hands, the kind of color cross-pollinates to other areas. I use blending sticks. I find it's really, really useful to use a blending stick, and these little guys, and basically it's really tightly rolled up paper, and you clean it on the sandpaper eraser. So it's basically little pieces of sandpaper cut into little strips, and then you just rub it left to right on this little paper, and you can keep turning this blending stick or stump on it to kind of clean the tip. Please do not unroll it or cut it or any of those things. All you need to do is kind of just file it down on your sandpaper eraser. And I normally have one. I don't really have lots of sizes. I just have like one, and I use it for almost anything, including my charcoals, or even I use it with graphite. It is a very economical and useful tool to have. When it comes to also not really fixing mistakes, but kind of sometimes picking up excess pastel and things like that, your kneaded eraser can be really useful, or just to lift stuff off. I find I also use an old bristle brush to lift pastel off my drawing. But the eraser can always be useful if you just want to pick up excess powder, or if you want to just clean up something. You'll see that when you are working with the pastels will stain or tint the paper. So even when you pick up pastel off your paper, the paper itself will stay a little bit stained and dirty. So the paper doesn't always clean completely. And the last thing on this slide is the artist tape. I use artist tape. You don't have to use artist tape, but if you do use artist tape, I use it to tape it down onto a piece of board so that my pastel stays clean. Also, sometimes I don't like to, I'll have a frame. So for example, I'll have my composition, I'll have my frame, and sometimes I don't want to work really hard to get the edging really straight. So what I end up doing is I end up taping the edge, and then I just run up to, with my pastel, I run to the edges of my pastel in order to kind of get this clean edge, and I just peel it off afterwards. My only word of advice around artist tape is, first of all, test it. Always test, test, test. The reason why I say that is because sometimes it can rip the paper. And once you've done a drawing and it's really great and you're happy with it, and then you're trying to peel the artist tape and it's ripping your paper, it's really not a great feeling. So test it. Also, do not leave your artist tape sitting on the drawing for very long periods of time. The longer the tape sits on the paper, any paper, it doesn't matter which paper, any paper, the more adhesive it becomes. So it becomes more binding to the paper. So you might actually end up ripping your drawing or ripping your paper if you leave it there for a long time. So I sometimes will leave it for a few hours. I'll leave it like maybe for a few days, but I try not to leave it there for longer than, let's say, a week, because it does stick to the paper and can ruin my drawing. So just be careful with that, and always just test to make sure it can lift and it won't rip your paper. Then there are other things, such as, I'm kind of starting on the right, I don't know why, but there's such a thing as like carbon paper or transfer paper. And what those things are is, I like to personally, I like to do a separate sketch on a piece of paper. So I'll take bond paper, or I'll take normal drawing paper. I'll sketch out my bird or my animal or my maybe, you know, fruit, whatever it is. And then once I'm happy with my drawing, I'll take carbon paper or transfer paper, lay it over my my pastel mat, and then trace over it. And the reason why I do that is because, first of all, then I have an original drawing I can always go back to if I need to, and secondly, it kind of keeps my paper clean. So if I'm sketching it out with a pastel pencil, sometimes I get a lot of pastel everywhere before I even get going. So I find this just keeps my work a little bit cleaner. Again, a little bit of a word of advice is that when you're working with really brand new paper or carbon paper, sometimes it's really, really dark and it's hard to cover. So be as light as you can. Also, sometimes you can create almost like a broken line or a dotted line where you're tracing it or transferring it. So you're not like, you know, pressing really hard on it and getting a very strong line, because to cover that or cover it or kind of cover up the line, it doesn't erase. So to cover it can be really, really hard. If anything, the pastel sticks can cover it, but not so much the pastel pencils. Then when you are done with your drawing, or even during the process, sometimes you want to spray between layers, but honestly, I don't do that. So I would say when I'm done with the work, you can spray your work with a fixative, and you want to be probably like about a foot away from the work when you're spraying it, and you spray it in a very even, let me see if you can see me, in a very even kind of fashion, right? And you want to do that because it is, pastels are very fragile. They powder, right? So even though you've draw your picture, when you rub your fingers over it, the whole thing is going to smudge. And again, that's not such a great feeling. So you want to protect it, you want to fix it. And what the fixative does is it just kind of solidifies everything, but it's not 100%. I find that even if you do 2 or 3 coats of fixative, and again, letting the fixative dry in between the coats, you still want a little bit of extra protection. So I'll find that what I end up doing, I actually skip the fixative unless it's going to go into the framers, or unless I have an exhibition, or unless I need to have the work scanned for a book or something like that. I will not really fix my work. I will immediately resort to glycine on my roll, and I'll cut sheets of glycine, and I'll almost like create like a little pocket, or I'll just put a sheet of glycine over my work. And what that does is just stops the work from getting smudged. And I love it. I use it for graphite, I use it for charcoal, I use it for pastel. This, I kind of have sheets of glycine in between all my work. It's really great for storage. So for example, if you have art drawers, I think you might even be able to see up with these little art drawers on the side, I'll put my work right one under the other, and I'll have sheets of glycine in between. And it really helps me protect my work, which is just, glycine and I are friends. It's like pastel mat, it's like the glycine. There are certain things I really, really love and I cannot do without. So that is one of them. Okay, so here's the video. In this one, I'm going to show you how to sharpen your pencil, how to transfer using transfer paper or carbon paper, and then also how to draw directly onto the paper. I am right-handed, so I'm holding the pencil in my left hand, and I'm angling the X-Acto knife or the anti-cutter blade at a very low angle so that I'm not cutting perpendicular into the pencil itself, because I'm trying to make sure I'm not breaking the lead. That is really key, so you have to be really gentle about it. This is the carbon paper, transfer paper. You want to make sure that you have the carbon or transferring side facing down onto your final piece of paper rather than up, because if you have it facing up, your transfer is going to transfer back onto your drawing. So you want to make sure that it's facing the right way. I'm using a fairly old sheet of carbon paper, so I can allow myself to press fairly hard, but you can, like I said, you can actually break your lines up or kind of make them a little bit lighter. You can do a little test for yourself. I also do not trace every single line. I just kind of roughly put down the shapes that I would like to. And I'm also transferring this onto construction paper. So it's one of the cheaper papers. And I'm doing it just to show you the different examples of transferring. Okay, so you can see it there. Also, instead of using transfer paper, you can also use pastel pencils and use the color that is going to be found in your main image. So if you're doing a bluebird, use a blue pencil. If you're using obviously like a yellow fruit, you want to use an orange pencil, a yellow pencil, whatever is going to blend in with the final image. The reason why I say that is that if you use a black pencil or something like that, it'll become really muddy and dirty. And sometimes people ask me, so why don't you use a graphite pencil? And you can, however, again, it interferes with the final drawing. Sometimes the graphite doesn't let you layer the pastel on top, so I find it can be a little bit of a nuisance, and it can also be quite hard and difficult to cover up again. So I would actually recommend that you do not use a graphite pencil, but rather use a pastel pencil, or even you could even use a color pencil. However, even then you get like wax or you get oil, and it sometimes interferes as well. So your pastel pencils are the best method. And if you need to erase, just use the kneaded eraser to kind of lift the pastel, and it'll be just fine. Okay, so this is the end of the first part. Hopefully I've covered everything. I'm sure you still have lots of questions, but I'm sure those will also be answered through the other videos, which will be like fruit and birds and some animals. And hopefully all of that will actually be answered for you. You can always leave a comment or maybe just email me if you have any other questions that perhaps I didn't cover. I hope it was informative. Thank you so much. This is going to be so much fun. I can't wait. I can't wait to see your pastel drawings. I know you're going to do great. Anyway, thank you so much. Bye.